podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer, and this is episode 9. Before we begin, I need to ask a favor. Can you please go to iTunes, and if you enjoy this podcast, please give it a rating. This will help spread the word about the podcast and bring the show to more listeners. My guest for this episode is percussionist John Parks. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, I teach at the Florida State University. I've been here for about 13 years, and I know Mark through EMF, which I was attending, I guess, for 4 years as part of the percussion section.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, the Eastern Music Festival happens in Greensboro, North Carolina every summer for 5 weeks. And my wife, Marta, is a cellist, and she's been at the festival for, since 2004. And so we met John through that. All right, John. So can you tell me your origin story, like how you got into music and why percussion, sort of how you came to be who you are?
Sure. I had kind of a non-traditional introduction to percussion anyway. My parents made me play the piano when I was a kid, probably from 3rd grade on, something like that. And my mom said, you have to play for 6 years and then you can quit if you want to. And then, of course, after 6 years, I was playing well enough that I didn't want to quit because I enjoyed it. And so fast forward a couple of years, and I switched teachers a few times. But what I didn't realize until I got to college was that my piano teacher was really only having me learn 2 pieces a year. And the reason for that was that she wanted to win all the competitions with her students in the state of North Carolina, which we did. But unfortunately, at the end of that year, I mean, I could play Beethoven and Chopin and whatever it was, and it would be amazing. But if you put Come to Jesus and whole notes in front of me, I wasn't going to be able to read it. This was a problem, right? And I think a lot of non-professional piano teachers do this. You know, it's kind of the trophy hunting, parent pressure model of music education. But at any rate, so it didn't really work that well for me, and I had always wanted to play drums, but my parents weren't very supportive of it. They thought that I was going to end up being a drug addict, like strung out on heroin and playing with Guns N' Roses or something. And so I kind of had to take matters into my own hands, and what I did was I used to watch MTV all the time. And you remember this because you and I are pretty close in age.
We're the same age.
Yeah, so back in like the 80s, you could just watch every band, basically playing along to their recordings or playing live on the show, on any of the shows. So, I got to see a lot of Rush videos and a lot of, heavy metal videos that I was really into. And so I kind of learned how to play by watching Neil Peart play.
Nice.
And so anyway, I really liked drums. And then I remember this very clearly. I was working in the sporting goods department at Belk's when I was in high school. And I came home from work one night, and I was flipping through the channels, and on PBS they had marching band, and I was like, "What is this?" And I saw a drum line for the first time, and so I tuned into it. And it turns out that it was the DCI finals. And I had no idea. I didn't even know this existed. I knew what a marching band was, but I had never seen anything like that. And so I watched that whole show. I videotaped it, and I must have just worn that videotape out watching it over and over and over and over and over again. So anyway, I decided to join our high school marching band, which was nothing like drum corps, unfortunately. And then when I went to college, I went as a piano major, but I was also playing in the drum line. And the reading thing really started to catch up with me. Everybody else in the piano studio would show up at studio class with like entire Brahms sonatas and Rachmaninoff etudes and stuff, and here I was like on the first page of some Beethoven sonata, suffering because I couldn't read fast enough to digest everything. Well, so then, from that perspective, just learning a snare drum etude or something seemed pretty simple by comparison, right? I mean,
yeah.
So I could read the rhythms pretty well, and I didn't have to worry about pitches at that point, so it seemed like a pretty easy thing to be able to do, and plus I liked it a lot. And so I just decided to switch over after my piano teacher finally gave me the last of the lectures about what I was going to do with my life and how I needed to get it together. And so finally I switched over, and my teacher, who was awesome, just kind of scooped me up from underneath and gave me a lot of confidence and let me play music that I could play, and then kind of gradually introduced me to more advanced concepts like four mallet playing and timpani and everything else. And then I started to realize just how difficult all of that stuff was.
Right.
But I got really super interested in it, and I started listening to a lot of orchestra music and going to see live concerts, and before long I was just completely hooked on it, and that was that.
You had a lot in there for us to unpack, so I think we'll just sort of go off of that for a little bit.
Sure.
So we're going to come back to the trophy hunting, because that's a topic that's come up in several of these interviews. But I want to talk about the DCI video you watched. Was that just on sort of normal access television?
Yeah, it was on PBS back then.
PBS. I remember watching it when I was in high school, but I don't remember where.
Yeah, it was PBS. I mean, all the companies, of course, sponsored, and Bill Cook's company sponsored. This was back when Star of Indiana was, really hip.
And you never did DCI?
I never did. The only year that I probably could have been competitive enough to do it marching-wise was going to be my junior year, and I really wanted to march with the Crossmen, but Mark Thurston was teaching there at the time. But then I blew my knee out in a snow skiing accident and basically had to have surgery, and there was no way I was going to be able to march on the leg the way that it was anyway. And back in those days, PT took a really long time for ACL reconstructions, whereas today it's pretty quick. So that pretty much blew me out on that.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about that idea of trophy hunting. One of the things I talked about with Mark Stickney, who was my last guest, he's a conductor at Plymouth State, was the idea of, sort of graded music and the notion of taking bands to competitions for trophies.
Oh man, it's super complicated. But at least from my piano experience, I think one of the reasons that my parents were interested in this particular teacher is that her track record was flawless. Like every single student was superior this, superior that, won this trophy here and that trophy there. And so my parents didn't know anything about music. So they looked at it almost like a sport. They're like, well, if my son and daughter take lessons with this woman, then they're going to win awards and they're going to be the best. And little did we know that there's a lot more to playing the piano than just learning, by rote. I understand the temptation, especially when you're starting out as an applied teacher. But really, the real key to being successful is your student achievements. And how you get those student achievements is just as important as the student achievements themselves. And I feel like if you're always coming from a place of what's going to be best for this student to be able to do what they want to do, and going from there rather than what do I need in order to sustain my efforts as a teacher or a performer or whatever it happens to be. If you're always student-centric and you're thinking as much about the method as the result, I think that's what sets up students for success.
I think that's a really good answer, actually. When we become selfish about it, when we put ourselves first, it seems to be that's when we run into problems.
Yeah, I mean, that's not what it's supposed to be about. I mean, you and I both know that at times, especially as professors, there's when you get promoted, when you get tenure, when you go up for faculty awards. I mean, yeah, you have to do a lot of stuff that seems like it's kind of you-centered,
Yeah.
But the thing that I've been really lucky to do is that all of my activity, both regionally, nationally, internationally, everything that I've done has been in the service of doing something for students. So if I'm in Thailand and I'm, giving concerts and giving master classes, I'm actively recruiting students from Thailand to come to Florida State.
Right.
Or making contacts with them so that eventually, and this happens all the time, it just happened this morning, I got a request from somebody in California that said, could you please look at my resume? I met you at PASIC a few years ago and you said that you would. I'm applying for jobs. Do you mind, taking a look at this and retooling it?
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, that's, somebody I met at a festival out in California. So I'm constantly, whether or not they come to FSU doesn't really matter, but just helping people no matter where they are. If you look at it from that perspective, then it becomes much less about you and what you're trying to achieve. But the administrators and all the people that are looking at you trying to come up with publications like a biologist as a performer, they look at that and they see, John played at the Thailand International, blah, 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 or John played at the Belgium International, or John did PASIC, or John did whatever it is. And to them, it still covers all of the bases. But, from my standpoint, when I go and play places, I'm not really going to show people that I can play. I'm going mostly to interest them in the program.
Right. So would you say that it's about you try to do the things that are required of you, but for service?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why we're teaching in the first place. It's not supposed to be about us, although there are things that we do, that have our names on it.
Sure, of course.
But I mean, I don't know. I think when you start skewing everything and saying, okay, well, this is about me and my performances and my audience and my followers and my this and my, all of a sudden you've completely lost the reason you're doing what you're doing in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting because, we see this with young teachers. Maybe they go into a situation where the previous director was winning awards and they feel the need to get those trophies up there for their administrators. Like high school teachers, we see this with all the festivals and
Oh yeah.
superior ratings. And so your advice then is to just stay focused on the teaching and let the awards come later.
I think so. I mean, if you look at the truly successful programs, if you look at, just looking at high school band, for example, and you look at the Woodlands, or you look at Ronald Reagan, or you look at Broken Arrow, or you look at Lassiter, or you look at these, really fabulous, well-rounded high school programs that are winning everything all the time.
Right.
If you go and you talk to their directors, they don't talk about winning.
Right.
They just talk about the process. And going to competition and going to these other things, those are just rewards for hard work by the students and staff. And yeah, it's great to win, but if they don't win, it's not the end of the world.
So you mentioned FSU, and you are the percussion professor there. And when you talk about students, what are you looking for in a student?
I'm looking for players that can come in and play what they can play at an extremely high level.
Right.
And I'm also looking for really good people, like really great citizens who are going to contribute and who are going to get along with everybody, because percussion is one of those instruments that, we touch everything. We're kind of like the janitors of the music school. We're involved in everything.
Right.
And there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of extra time, a lot of extra work that other people don't have to put in. And if you're a bad apple, it's really easy for that to be like a virus and to catch throughout the studio. And I just can't afford to have that happen. So even if a player comes in and they're just awesome, but I get any kind of inkling that they're a jerk, and this is something that I do for anybody listening who wants the audition. I have students outside the studio, and I have my students downstairs by the practice rooms, and they are listening and watching everything. They hear anybody talking smack, or they hear anybody being a jerk, or they hear any of that kind of stuff, I find out about it. And I've turned down many a student who played great, who definitely played well enough to get in, just because there were several occurrences of, some shenanigans out in the hallway or down by the practice rooms that gave me pause.
Well, personality is so important in everything, whether it's you're applying for a job or you're trying to be in a studio, or even in a band. You get one student who sort of poisons the well. It can be really difficult. I see that in college classrooms too. In a theory class, it happens.
Oh yeah, it can ruin everything.
Exactly. It can make a semester much more difficult.
Totally. And trying to disarm that over time is so exhausting. And, I have a very set way of dealing with them.
You want to talk about that?
Sure. Well, basically when you come to FSU, if when you're a freshman or a sophomore, you're going to study with TAs. And then you study with me your junior year, your senior year, and of course all the grad students work with me as well. So if you end up being a real problem, then you ending up in the lowest band. You get no orchestra playing, you get no percussion ensemble parts, and then when it comes to you being a junior, if you make it that far, you don't get to study with me. Now, granted, our TAs are amazing, and you could easily study with them for 4 years and get a great education. But at the same time, if you're there to study with the main teacher and the main teacher doesn't want you to work with them, that's pretty alarming. Not to mention that I don't know that students understand just how much reach we have over them for recommendations, for graduate school, for jobs. Even if they wanted to be an intern in a dentist's office, we're going to get called, and I'm going to give that recommendation. And it's funny, I have 2 letters that I read out loud to the class in the first studio class every year, and one is a really amazing recommendation that is a real one that I've written for one of my best students. And then the other one is a real recommendation that I wrote for one of my worst students that I ever dealt with. And I just read them both and let the students hear what actually goes into these recommendation letters. Because I think it's kind of an abstract concept for them. They don't really understand what that letter is, or because they don't ever get to see it, right? But at any rate, so I'd do this right off the bat and say, look, it's up to you, but I'm not going to lie for you. I'll tell the truth, and if it happens to be letter number 1, then good things are going to happen. If it happens to be letter number 2, you're going to have a hard time learning how to do anything.
We see this a lot, the percussion sections, especially in high school bands. If you're not playing music that has a lot of percussion parts, you have a lot of free time back there.
Oh, yeah.
And so, kids are kids. They do kid things, as I've mentioned on this show before. Do you have any advice for what you could do with those students who maybe are looking for something to do? Let's say it's a smaller school that doesn't have a percussion ensemble or an assistant director or
something like that.
Well, yeah, because when I was a director, it was just me. So I had to deal with everything. I had to conduct and manage the students.
So what would you say to this? If you were still doing that job and I came in there as the guy from the local college and I said, I've got a student who can come in and take your percussionists in sixth period and work on all of the band parts and make sure that they're ready to go, but we can also do some quartets and trios and duets and whatever else to work on their musicianship and their chamber music playing. And then maybe out of every 3 band rehearsals, they're back in class with you, able to nail everything.
I would say how much.
How much you're going to charge?
Yeah, exactly. It was always the bottom line when I was a teacher.
Well, the thing is, especially with an undergrad, for example, like, maybe a sophomore or a junior, I mean, sure, everybody needs the money, but they also need the experience.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point, is that if you're around a college, and most high schools are near a college, there might be a student who can come out and volunteer sometime.
Absolutely. I've got students that are out in the high schools all the time.
Yeah, that's actually really good advice.
So, I mean, it's just a matter of, if you think about it as a band director, and I've been there too, man. My first job was assistant director of bands, and I did a lot of conducting. I ran the marching band at the school where I was. So I totally understand it. Even as a percussionist, watching those percussionists get bored because I'm working with the clarinets or I'm working with the trumpets or I'm working on balance or blend or intonation or, whatever it happens to be. So I've seen that. And even with me on the podium at that point, if I could have had somebody to come in and say, all right, let's just take you guys out and do sectionals, I totally would have done it because there's plenty to fix in the band, right?
Oh, of course.
There's always plenty of stuff to fix. I think that's definitely time better spent than watching you or watching me work with the flutes for 30 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which that's just kind of a rehearsal thing too. Is one of my mentors used to say, if you can't fix it in 5 seconds, leave it for after rehearsal.
Yeah, that's good advice. So if you're giving advice to maybe a middle school or someone who's doing beginning band, are there qualities that you think a student should have or a young person should have to be a percussionist?
Oh yeah, I'm sure you do, or you did lots of tests and stuff like that. Kids, where you check pitches and you say, okay, was this higher or is this lower? Because some kids can't hear that.
Right.
I'd get rid of them immediately. If they can't play rhythms back to you, if you clap rhythms to them and they can't clap them back to you, I think that's a problem. If you are going back and forth showing them how to hold the sticks and they can't seem to get, just percussion all the instruments are difficult, but percussion, especially at that point, if people aren't able to do these very simple things, then it's going to be an uphill battle for them the whole way.
Right. One of the things I heard is that, it's like trumpets. There's a certain personality to play the trumpet because you're heard, you're present a lot. But for a percussionist, basically in every piece, every percussionist is a soloist.
That's true.
And so would you say you have to have a student, maybe a young person who has that desire to be the center of attention or the willingness to be?
I think you just have to have guts.
Yeah.
It's not so much that you're going to bring tons of attention to yourself as much as you're just contributing to the whole. But at the same time, you've got to have enough guts to trust that when you count 300 bars and you come in with this solo cymbal crash, that you know exactly where it's supposed to be. As Sam Denov, who was the cymbal player for the Chicago Symphony for up until 1986, used to say, he'd say cymbal players have to have the heart of a lion. And that's always stuck with me, like just being able to make sure that you put things exactly where they're supposed to be and just the knowledge and guts to put it where it's supposed to be.
Boy, it seems like percussionists, in all the years I've been in bands, always attract some of the most vitriolic comments from the conductors, too.
Yeah, well, don't you think a lot of that is just from they don't understand? It's complete misunderstanding.
If you had your chance to sort of say, you're going to go be a high school teacher, or you're going to go be a middle school band director, here's what I think as a percussionist you should have, the tools you should have.
First, you got to have patience, obviously, a whole lot of patience. 2, you have to understand what it's like to play really well, so that you can teach the students how to play really well. I think it's important, or it's impossible for you to get them to try and do something over and over and over again if you don't actually know what that level is supposed to be.
Right, as far as on their own instrument?
Yeah, like if especially with a percussion teacher. Like if you're coming in and you're working with a group and you're doing a percussion ensemble, but your experience has not been at a very high level, there's no way you're going to get the students past that. I mean, I don't see how that's possible. It's like, how can you get a band to play in tune if you've never been in a group that played in tune and been working with a teacher who taught you how to play in tune?
It seems like there's a mindset among students that, oh, I'm just going to be a teacher. I don't need to play well. Or I'm just going to go do this. I don't need to play my instrument well. But it all starts from the idea of you play your instrument to the best of your ability, and that musicianship carries you.
I mean, if you don't have any high-level music experiences, how can you possibly get other people to have high-level music experiences if you don't know how to do it? It's like, how can you possibly coach basketball without having played basketball? Understanding what your students are capable of and having a long-term plan. So if you've got a 5-year plan of getting them to play grade 5 literature, but you're starting at grade 1, you don't start off with grade 5 and think that you can rote teach them. It happens all the time. It happens with applied students. Students come in and they play for a year or two, and then the student comes in and says, hey, I need a 4 mallet solo for solo and ensemble. Oh, well, I only played one when I was in college, and it was Mexican dances. Okay, well, here's the Mexican dances. Your kid's in 8th grade. There's no way that's going to work out. There's no way. But sometimes what happens is that these kids, they keep getting reinforced by their teachers who don't know any better in the first place, that what they're doing is actually really, really good. And then they show up solo and ensemble, or they show up at Florida State or whatever else it is, and they get like a 0 at solo and ensemble because they can barely, the judges can barely tell what the student's playing. Or for us, they just get rejected after being told by their percussion teacher for however many years that they're, just awesome and that everything they're playing is terrific. And I mean, I think a lot of that comes from the teachers just not knowing what terrific really is.
Yeah, it ties back a little bit to what we started with about, learning pieces and not skills.
Yeah, totally. I mean, say you're a first-year band director and you've got, 30 kids in your wind ensemble, and none of them, basically even have a high school music education. It's basically a glorified community band for 18-year-olds, and you try and play Lincolnshire Posy. Now, on the program, it does say that you played Lincolnshire Posy. But there's a big difference between what's on the program and saying, oh, what'd your band do last year? Oh, we did Lincolnshire. Oh, really? Wow, it's your first year and they've never had a band at that school before. That's really impressive. No, that's not impressive. That's stupid.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I don't know what to say. I'm going to leave it at that on the interview, John. Edit this out.
It's like, man, I'm going to edit this out as soon as I get done.
Man, well, because you just sort of said it and I'm sort of left speechless, Sometimes there's not a follow-up.
Well, I don't get into the whole, what are you playing? What am I playing? Kind of thing. But I think it's easy for students to get into because, kids, they go to all county or all region or all state or tri-state or, whatever it happens to be. And they start talking to their friends. Well, what are you playing in lessons? Oh, I'm playing this and I'm playing that and I'm playing that. And then they think, oh, that's a lot better than what I'm playing.
Sure.
Maybe I should play that stuff. And then they start working on it, but they don't have any business working on it. I mean, it'd be like, giving somebody a sentence in Russian. Eventually they could figure out how to say it. But unless you can read Russian, and I think that kind of cycles back to what we were talking about with teaching outcomes and whatnot. It's like your job is to teach the kids Russian. It's not to teach them how to enunciate one sentence in Russian so they sound Russian, even though they have no idea what they're doing and they can't read anything else in Russian.
Right. Absolutely. So do you have any sort of, I know you do your videos. Well, I love those. I share them for the music ed students all the time.
Thank you.
So do you have any other resources that you would recommend for a teacher?
Those are pretty terrific. Like Black Swamp videos in general, not mine necessarily. They've got a ton of them on their YouTube page. The Vic Firth page has more videos than you could probably comb through in a lifetime. I think on almost every manufacturer's website now, there's a pretty major social media presence with videos and audio and other kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, and most students know this because they're not interested in reading anything. They're interested in watching stuff, as you know.
Yeah.
And, as far as that kind of thing goes, I think Vic Firth has probably done the best job of putting everything together that both deals with, say, okay, here's how you hold the sticks, all the way up to, okay, here's percussion playing, it's about time. And they've got everything in between. I think they're probably the most exhaustive and thorough as far as that's concerned. So that's a terrific resource.
So, John, I'm going to change directions a little bit. What advice would you give to composers?
I think one of the things that I always struggled with the most when I was a principal in making assignments is when composers simply write for whatever instrument they want at the time and then kind of arbitrarily assign it to percussion 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Is a repeat offender in this. You listen to his music and you watch a percussion section get through it and you think, oh, this isn't so bad. But the only reason that it isn't so bad is because the percussionists have probably had to rewrite all of the parts in order to make them work. So, for example, we'll put percussion 1, marimba, vibraphone, chimes, crotales, whip, bass drum, tom-toms, 3 gongs, temple bowls, and triangle.
Mm-hmm.
Percussion 2, marimba, vibraphones, temple gongs, bass drum, slapstick, chimes, 3 tom-toms, whatever it happens to be. And what you think when you look at it is, okay, so percussion 1 is going to have this massive 365-degree setup over in one corner of the band room, and we're going to have these 6 circles of instruments because everybody needs a xylophone and everybody plays on marimba and everybody plays on vibraphone, instead of saying, okay, percussion 1, marimba, percussion 2, vibraphone and xylophone, percussion 3, snare drum, tom-toms, woodblocks, percussion 4, gongs, chimes. It's and actually thinking about, okay, what can a person get to and what will a person have access to? I mean, we have 6 xylophones, but we're not using 6 xylophones on one just to have one in every setup because we're going to go verbatim. I mean, there are other composers that do this who I'll not name, but is probably the worst. And so what ends up happening is that whenever something like that comes up with wind orchestra or symphonic band or whatever happens to be here, the section has to get together and kind of translate everything that's happening into setups that are actually doable. And that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of re-entry of all of the information into Sibelius or Finale in order to generate new parts. I mean, it's just really, really complicated. So my biggest suggestion would be, try and parse things out and think of it like, if you've got a lot of marimba in your piece, why not just have one person play all of those marimba parts?
Sure. Absolutely. You want to try to set it up. And so this is good advice for band directors, too, to rewrite those parts in a way that it minimizes that confusion.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you can do it, if you got a section that's willing to do it, and let's face it, you have to, right?
Right.
I mean, Larry is going to program this, and he's not going to sit there and listen to you whine about the fact that, he didn't map out his parts very well. He expects, as does every conductor in any professional organization, that when it comes time to play that piece, you've got it figured out. You've already got it worked out.
Absolutely.
And so I think in one way is a great teaching tool because it shows students the ultimate screwed up percussion map and a jigsaw puzzle and makes them solve it. But having to solve that for like every piece on a program or, for an entire program or for a whole semester can really, really make people dark. So I would say, and they get really dark on those composers. It doesn't take many pieces by, fill in the blank composer for students to start thinking, man, please God, don't play another one of these. Please no.
That's interesting because, that's sort of the relationship that a composer is looking for the most.
Oh, yeah.
So do you see that, you're an orchestral percussionist as well. Have you seen that with many of the great works?
Not with the great works. Fortunately for us, there's a guy named Rainer Carroll who played with L.A. for ages and ages. And he not only has been putting together these repertoire books over the last 20 years, but he's put together this huge, 3-inch volume of assignments.
Oh, that's cool.
Basically anything that you can think of. It's kind of like the... what's the orchestra book? The one I'm talking about, the Daniels. It's like the Daniels, which tells you the instrumental breakdown for every work. It does that with percussion breakdown. So it takes everything and shows you who can play what where, what bars need to go here, what needs to go there. It's basically like solving the problems for all the major repertoire. And he's always adding new stuff to it. So really, unless you get something that is brand spanking new off the press, Rainer's probably already figured it out. Or you can call somebody who just did it. Like if I'm, my orchestra is going to play City Noir or something, I know who played it recently, so I can call them and ask them how they did it.
Sure. That's That's great. That sounds like a great doctoral project for someone to do with some of the big band works.
Band works? Oh, it would be amazing if somebody did that. I'll think about that for my next doctoral student coming along. I've got
someone who doesn't know what to do, right? So, John, we talked a little bit about it before I started the interview formal, but do you want to talk about your experiences in wind ensemble, and especially the Eastman wind ensemble?
I was really lucky. I had a lot of great wind band experience when I was coming through school. When I was at Furman, I was under John Carmichael, who's now at the University of South Florida, for 4 years. And then when I was at Northwestern, I worked with John Painter for both of my master's degrees, which was pretty amazing. Mr. Painter, as you know, just super iconic guy, not only because he was an amazing conductor and what we would consider a classic band director, but he was such a sweetheart, too. And then when I got to Eastman, I got to work with Donald Hunsberger on several occasions. The most, I guess, important one was the 2000 Japan and Taiwan tour, which was Hunsberger's last tour. And just playing in that group, which, you know, as you and I discussed, most people consider the Eastman Wind Ensemble to be the group that they hear at Midwest or that they see out on tour or, you know, whatever it happens to be, or they listen to on recordings. But in truth, the Wind Ensemble is actually not that group on a daily basis. That group has been auditioned for every single position against everyone in the school. So by the time the Eastman Wind Ensemble goes on tour, that's the best, you know, however many people are in the group at Eastman, period. So, and for our percussion section, I mean, it was basically an all-star section. It was an all-star section with every section in the group. And just how quickly we got to sounding pretty amazing and how much better that got every night on the tour was probably one of the most amazing performance experiences I've ever had. I mean, I will never forget that.
Wow. What literature did you do on that trip?
Well, we had 2 concerts that we would do. The first had, I'm trying to remember, I think it was, there was a Bernard Rand's piece, and God, it's been 17 years, so I'll have to think about it for a second.
Was that recorded?
Part of it was the Eastman Wind Ensemble at 50 disc that has Porgy and Bess on it. That was us. That was me playing xylophone, actually.
The Porgy xylophone part.
The Porgy xylophone part with the wind ensemble version, which is half step down.
Oh.
From the original.
Oh no!
Oh no! It ended up being fine. It was just a little freaky because some of the turnarounds end up being the same notes in different places. It was just kind of
right. Well, that's one of the great excerpts.
Oh yeah.
And so you must have drilled that the half step up.
I did. Well, the funny thing was I saw Hunsberger in the hallway once, and I knew that we were going to do Porgy, and I just kept pushing him. I was like, "What key? What key is it going to be in? Is it going to be in?" And he just kept smiling all the time. And then finally, you know, we got the parts like the day of the first rehearsal that we were going to have on it. And so I got our parts, I signed everything, and then ran upstairs to the practice room and just started drilling like crazy on it.
I bet.
And then, of course, and not only from that rehearsal, but every night on tour, as soon as we cranked that thing up, he was looking squarely at me for that excerpt instead of everybody else who plays it. So I ended up playing it a lot on that tour. But, yeah, that's me on the recording.
Cool.
Yeah, we recorded in Tokyo Opera City, which is probably one of the most amazing halls I've ever been in, for sure. It was an amazing tour. We played all over the place, and we were actually following the Philadelphia Orchestra on their tour of Japan. So we were playing all the same halls and playing and staying in the same hotels. I mean, it was really as close to being as a rock star as you probably could be, you know, as a percussionist.
All right, John. So I ask a couple questions of all my guests. What advice would you give to your younger self if you were to look back and tell the John who was in college, just starting out?
I'd say 2 things. One is that I would practice even more. You know, if there's a spare moment anywhere, practice. I think I kind of got into 2 or 3 hours is enough, and 2 or 3 hours is not enough for anything. So I wish when I was younger that I'd practiced a lot more, but I kind of made up for it when I got to graduate school.
Sure.
But if I had been that much better before I got there, then how much better would I be now? And the other thing is just, percussionists kind of have to get along with everybody.
Yep.
And I'm not sure that was my number one trait when I was younger. I think I was probably much more of a jerk than I am now. Although there are plenty of people that think I'm a jerk now, but I think definitely if you polled people back in those days, I think I probably had a higher jerk quotient than I do at the moment. And so I would try and probably get along with people a lot better and try to work together with people better. than I did when I was younger.
Right. Relationships are so important.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So how about band literature? Do you have something that you like to work on or that you like to see, or if you had to conduct a wind ensemble, do you have a piece that you would want to do?
I still get excited when I hear a really great group do Irish Tune.
It's such a terrific piece.
It really is, and that was one of our encores in Japan. And so that's the other thing. Just to go back to that for a second, in Japan you'll play 4 or 5 encores. It's the most insane thing I've ever seen. I mean, we had people come out and like start rolling, like trying to push the buses.
That's crazy.
After a wind ensemble concert, we're all in tails.
You're like the Beatles.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, we'd show up at the airport, and there would be people there asking for autographs. I mean, I have picture after picture after picture of kids, like of me signing autographs, and they'd come up to you, and they'd open up this color program and find your picture in it, and they'd point to you, and you would sign over your picture. It was the most surreal thing. I still never had anything happen like that.
Yeah, well, I don't think most people do.
Oh my God, it was amazing. But Irish Tune's great. I love Schwantner. I love Sea Drift is one of my favorite pieces, the Ionicone, which I really like a lot. And just about anything I get to play is a favorite. If I'm playing, then it's all good.
Well, one thing I'll say, John, as someone who's an outside observer watching you over the years, you have an enthusiasm. It's infectious when you play.
Oh, well, thank you.
You really like to play, and it's obvious.
I do. I definitely do.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share or promote?
No, not really. I'm just happy to be on the program.
Well, I'm happy to have you. This is, as I said, it's sort of my hobby, and I'm hoping that it just continues. And it's really great to be able to talk to really fine musicians and people who are doing things in the field.
That's fun, man. I'm just happy you had me on.
Do you want to talk about that, the percussion ensemble and your recording stuff?
Sure. Now
do you want to tell everyone about
there's
that?
A whole nother podcast right there.
Sure, but maybe the abridged.
The abridged version. God, I guess about 10 years ago, I was just looking for ways to. I'm constantly doing this. Like, what can we do that nobody else is doing, kind of thing. And so I started getting into recording technology, and we had a whole bunch of stuff installed, and I learned how to use it all, and did this and did that, and joined this group and did that group, and then I became a Grammy voter and got really involved with a lot of classical engineers around the country. And what started as I want equipment there for students to record themselves in high-definition audio has turned into a full-service recording program now. Where with our percussion ensemble, we're currently working on our 4th CD, and it's amazing because we have, literally just an astounding amount of stuff, of software and hardware that make us sound the way that we do. And so the students are learning how to use all of this stuff. They're starting their own recording companies. They're recording pre-screening audition tapes for everybody. It's really turned into this massive entrepreneurial, exercise.
And that gives them such great experience with that.
Yeah. Now on their resumes, they actually have, recording engineer. Here are the discs I worked on. Here I was a producer on this. I did this. Here are the recordings, et cetera. And, a lot of them, when they get into their graduate programs, their TAs end up either being in percussion or sometimes half percussion, half music technology, where they're actually working with the recording arts and services people at, NEC or Juilliard or wherever it happens to be that they're going. So it's really become this kind of monster, but we're the only program in the country that has it integrated into the applied curriculum at this level.
Right. It's such a value add to your program, and it sets you apart. That's great.
It is great. I love it. I was working on something this morning, actually, for the new CD, so I'm constantly working on it. The students are constantly learning. They're buying all of their own equipment now. It's really crazy, but it's a lot of fun. And it doesn't take away from what they're doing. It's if anything, it makes them better faster. And I think that's like the biggest thing about the recordings. But for our CDs, basically the reason that we do them is because we can. It's not really a vanity thing as much as it is we work with a lot of composers. We commission a lot of repertoire, and then we put it on these discs, and then we send out 1,500, 2,000 of them to all the percussion programs around the country, who then A, get to hear our students play, B, get to hear the level that they're playing and the level of the recording, and also get to experience these new composers they've never heard of.
Is there a label for the CDs? Or?
For us, yeah, it's my label. It's Garnet House Productions.
Yeah. All right. So now, you know what? I wanted to ask you about the The articles, your editorial with the football coach.
Oh, yes.
Do you want to talk about that or not?
Sure.
Well, you just kind of like cringe, so I don't want to force it on you.
No, it's funny. It's just funny because I was talking about it the other day with somebody, and because obviously football season's coming up, and we're starting off the season against Alabama.
Oh yeah, it's already gearing up.
I know, which is going to be just incredible. And plus, I don't know if you followed this whole thing that University of Michigan and I had a bet going on the Orange Bowl.
Oh yeah, that was awesome, by the
way. So football's been on the brain a lot recently, and as well as just watching sports a lot in general. But basically, what happened was I was watching football. I was watching the Ohio State-Michigan game, and of course, if you saw the end of that game, it was just incredibly crazy. And my son, who's 9, was watching it with me, and he just noted the fact that Harbaugh and Urban Meyer were both just screaming profanities.
Yep.
And it's wild. The TV stations actually, whenever anything happens, they go directly to the coaches, like to get their reactions, which usually are, fire and brimstone, either screaming at a player or screaming at refs or screaming just to scream or, whatever it happens to be. So anyway, we were talking about it, and Gabriel said, do you scream like that at your students? And I was like, well, no, I'd get fired. Not to mention the disrespectful nature of it. I would totally undermine myself as a leader. I would undermine myself as a role model. I just started listing off all of these things, and I was like, you know what? It's too bad that coaches aren't held accountable. But then I thought maybe they should be, because they are teachers at the university. Now, granted, somebody like Jimbo has God knows how many millions of dollars in money coming from Nike and from the Seminole boosters, who are somewhat separate from the university. And then he makes, however much from the university, like $1.5 million or whatever it happens to be. But he ends up making like $5 or $6 million. But he still is an employee of Florida State, right?
Yep.
So as such, and those are still students on the field, and he's a teacher of those students. He's a steward of those students. And so I just started thinking, well, if that's the case, then he should be held to the same standard that I am, which is that if I pulled in a student and I told him that he was a stupid you-know-whatter, and regardless of whether anybody heard it, but you can imagine if I went on stage during a rehearsal and just started screaming at some percussionist in the back, I'd be in the dean's office within 15 minutes.
You mean it's not like the movie Whiplash?
Now, you and I both know that old school teachers, those people did exist.
They sure did.
They certainly did exist, both in the professional orchestra world, in the college world, in the band world, in the percussion world, for that matter. It was like that to an extent. But at the same time, these days, you can't get away with something like that. A student, people have phones out. They're shooting video of you all the time. There's no way. And, you can imagine what would happen if I did something like that. Like if Clary had a dress rehearsal and one of the students was blowing something, I ran on stage and read him the riot act with as many, curse words as I possibly could summon, even artistically, that there's not going to be some kind of punishment for that. Even me being tenured as a full professor, there's going to be a ramification. There's going to be something, a consequence. So I started thinking, man, these guys are doing, they'd be gone after like 5 minutes if that's what it was. And so anyway, I wrote this article, and I had a friend who used to work for Coca here in town who now works for the newspaper. I didn't really know exactly what she did at the time, but I sent her the article and said, what do you think of this? And she ran it in the editorial section. And it garnered an incredible amount of commentary. It got shared over 5,000 times on Facebook. The comments that I got from both sides were just amazing in every sense of the word.
I saw some of them.
Oh, yeah, just amazing stuff. But the beautiful thing was, I also heard from 2 state senators and from some other pretty prominent people in the community that were like totally agreed, and thought that the place that we found ourselves, although not as bad as some other places, is not something that we want when we think about the university. So anyway, I wrote that. Then there was a rebuttal that one of my now friends wrote, who, wrote back and said, now, wait a minute. You don't know these coaches. This is what they're doing. This is what they're doing off the field.
Sure.
And of course, I wrote back, and that got published too, that said, wow, I understand what you're doing. That's their job. their job is to take care of those students and write recommendations and, take care of it. That's what they're supposed to be doing. It's not just winning football games. Well, then he and I ended up meeting up and talking for like 3 hours, which was awesome. He was a former professional basketball player in Spain who played for FSU. His name's Adrian Crawford. Super nice guy.
Uh-huh.
And then I also met with Diane Roberts, who wrote a book called Tribal that you might really be interested in.
I know Diane.
Yeah, she's amazing.
She is.
And so we went out and had a great time and just talking about, basically these same issues. And what I've come to is that one of the major problems that coaches have is that they have no certification for what they do, no official certification. So, for example, if you want to be a football coach one day, typically you play football in junior high, you play in high school, you go and you play in college. Then for your master's degree, you do like sports administration or something like that, and you're a TA for the football team. And then eventually you get moved on to like a position coach or an assistant position coach somewhere. And then you move up through the ranks until you get to be a position coach, and then maybe you get to be an offensive line coach or a defensive coach, and then eventually you become an assistant coach, then you become a head coach, and then you become an assistant coach at a larger program, then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until you end up where you're going to end up, right?
Yep.
So you do all that, and the only modeling you have is the coaching that you've received and that you've observed.
Sure.
Which may or may not have anything to do with what's acceptable and what's not acceptable.
Right.
As a result, I don't know that, these guys who are such horrible offenders, I know that they know that it's wrong, but I just don't think that they care because that's how they learn.
Right. You teach the way you know.
Absolutely, and that's the only thing that they have. I mean, none of these guys are going to like coaching conventions where John Wooden's ghost comes and says, hey, this is how you should motivate your kids, and you shouldn't be thinking about winning trophies. You should think about, putting your kids in positions to be successful in life. And instead of, if somebody drops the ball 3 times, instead of asking them what their MFing problem is and, taking like in Friday Night Lights and taking duct tape and duct taping their hands to a ball, maybe just sitting them down and saying, okay, when we get back to practice, here's what we're going to work on. We're going to find a way to get you to do this and overcome it physically and mentally so that you can carry the ball. And this is important because this is something that you'll take on for the rest of your life. And I, certainly don't equate what I do at that level. But if we were to say, okay, if we looked at it and said, okay, well, what exactly are we trying to do as teachers? If I'm trying to get my students to do these amazing things with their lives, and some of them are going to end up in music, most of them do. Some of them end up being doctors. Some end up being lawyers. Some end up being landscape architects. I've got one former student who's a professional poker player. But the thing is, if you ask all of them about their time here, they would tell you that the lessons that they learned about discipline and motivation and working with others and all of that kind of stuff that we gloss over sometimes when we talk about sports, they learned from music. And if the football coaches would look at it the same way, and if there were something like the NCAA who said, okay, from now on we're going to have a mandatory weekend prior to the football season starting, and where you have to show up and somebody's going to come in and talk to you about best practices.
It's interesting because, in Europe, soccer coaches have to be certified.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think here, too, isn't that like a FIFA thing?
I believe it is.
Yeah. It's interesting that sport does that. I suppose I know the counter-arguments to all these things. Well, it's football, and it's emotional, and blah, 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 blah.
That was basically the argument that Adrian had was, you don't understand until you've been there. But in my profession, if you miss things, you get fired. You don't get to survive with a 50%, free throw rate. That's not how it works. Now, granted, the payoff is not nearly as great. I mean, but none of us are in music for the money.
You didn't miss 50% of the notes on your Porgy and Bess solo with the Eastman Ensemble.
I don't remember.
Well, I'm going to go listen to the recording and tell you.
Good. I don't think so. I'm hoping that it's good. I remember when we record. I remember it because it was all live, and then we had a patch session after the first concert, and Hunsberger was like, "Does anybody need the opening?" And I was like, "I hope not."
Well, John, this was a terrific conversation. I really want to thank you for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Mark. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Awesome.